All right. Learn how to set fair pricing in 12 minutes. And the key pricing mistakes we see so many clubs make, whether they've been in existence for 10 or 20 years or they're startups. So this is going to be relevant for both nonprofit and for-profit clubs. And I'm going to jump right into the mistakes that we often see. Number one mistake I see when consulting with clubs is they always look at what everybody else charges and they set their pricing based on that. You have no idea if someone has a subsidized facility, if they're not paying their coaches, if they're not paying for insurance. You don't know what their fixed expenses are. You don't know what their variable expenses are. You don't know if they're doing things legitimately. And so when you're looking at your competitors and you're deciding on the price point, you're immediately assuming they're in the same financial position as your program is, whether it's a nonprofit or for profit. You're also assuming that individuals only want to pay based on lowest cost possible. And by positioning your program as the lowest cost alternative, it is going to be assumed to be the worst program. Just like if I'm looking at purchasing bread at the grocery store and there's the low cost white bread and then there's the premium bread, my wife and I almost never buy the low cost wholesome white bread. We almost always buy the premium bread because there is an assumption that it's healthier, whether we read the ingredients list or not. And so when you are pricing your program, you want to understand the positioning in your market. I am not saying avoid looking at competitors completely, but do not use that as the baseline for where you're setting your costs. Second thing that you really want to understand is in wrestling, we typically only look at wrestling, but you need to look at other youth sport providers and understand what other youth sports programs in your community are charging. And look at the ones that offer equivalent programming to you, both on a time and value perspective. Meaning if it's a 45-minute class and you offer a 45-minute class, that's a good comparable. Right? Meaning that if it is 1 student to 6 student coach to student ratio, it's a good comparable, right? If you have 1 coach to 30 students and someone else provides 1 coach to 6 students, you might not have found a good comparable because they're offering a more premium product. Some of those comparables aren't as direct as they may seem. So outside of the direct comparables that aren't maybe so direct and understanding your positioning with the value that you're providing to your athletes and your families and making sure that you're pricing your program accordingly. Oftentimes when I'm having conversations with clubs about setting their pricing, they're failing to look at the number one most important thing, which is not necessarily what your customers can pay or your families can pay. It's what your expenses are. And if you don't factor your expenses into your pricing, you will not survive. You will not be successful, right? If I need to charge $17 for a hamburger and I only charge $7 or my customers can only pay $7, there's a gap in revenue that I'm going to have to come up with somehow in order for my program to continue to exist. And so that is the most dangerous mistake, is not understanding your expenses, not factoring your expenses into your pricing. That should be number one. So expenses that are very clear what to include in our pricing, Matt's going to cover in a minute. But some of the basic expenses I see often forgotten are paying yourself, the director or the owner of the organization, for your administrative time and paying yourself for your coaching time. Making sure that you understand how to make this sustainable for your family and viable for you as far as giving your time to the organization if it's a nonprofit, or giving your time to your business if it's for profit. And the second thing that you really need to consider outside of expenses is how much do you need to continue doing this? If you are doing this exclusively as a volunteer and that is your passion, is to volunteer for this, and that's your way to give back and you don't need to earn a living on it, awesome, right? That is your contribution. For a private club owner, oftentimes your objective is to not need to have another job, right? My passion is to make it so wrestling can have more full-time people in it and then the experience for the families and the kids become better. And so if you need to replace an income of $100,000 a year or 80,000 or 60 or 150, depending where you live, that's your starting point, right? Or if you need to pay your coaches that and you don't take anything because it's a nonprofit, there's no ownership, but you want to hire a really, really good coach that can be all in on the kids year round, it's going to cost $50,000 to $60,000 to pay that coach so that they don't have to go and be a plumber or be an educator and be competitive. Expenses you need to factor in: facilities, obviously your fixed and variable costs, our insurance. Insurance kind of goes up or down depending on the number of athletes you have or any liability claims. Your coach's pay, which we're going to go into in a minute, and then your administrator hours, right? You should be paying your administrators so that they can be full-time, whether you're USA Wrestling New Jersey and you're paying your administrators, or you're Beat the Streets Philadelphia and you're paying your administrators, or you're a startup Kinnelon Rec program and you should at least be paying your administrators so they can do this for duration. Coaching pay should be a livable wage, right? And so coaching pay should be comparable to what I could make in another hands-on trade. So if I can go be a mechanic for 50 an hour in your area, then you should be paying your coaches 50 an hour. How I used to price, I figured out all these fixed costs. I looked at how many hours of training I did for a level, and then I saw what my per hour costs were. And then I just added a random number on. So I would go, okay, if it cost me $11 an hour to run this program per kid, I would charge 20. And I knew I had a $9 margin. It worked, but it wasn't super sophisticated, but it did get me kind of off the ground until Matt and I could do a little bit more of a deep dive. So Matt, I want to hand it over to you so you can tell us how we really should be looking at pricing.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. I'm happy to send a copy to anybody who wants it. But like Jeff says, the goal of this spreadsheet is to work backwards to this number here in profit that makes this possible, whatever your situation is.
Can I speak to that real quick? So again, now your goal might be to break even or to leave $3,000 in the account at the end of the year, right? It doesn't mean that you need to profit $119,000 to make it a career replacement for the owner, but you do need to start with profit first and make sure that you understand where you need to be at the end of 12 months so that you're not negative. I've seen so many nonprofit organizations that I worked with that year after year were in a deficit and taking loans or personal lending or putting it on the director's credit card. And they just didn't want to say anything because they didn't want the nonprofit to go away.
Yep, absolutely. And nonprofits in particular, one of the common reasons local nonprofits dissolve is there's that one person in there for 20 years who doesn't pay themselves and they do a great job. And then suddenly they need to transition out and the organization doesn't have the assets to get a quality person in there. So if you have an extra 20, 30 grand a year, you can make sure that organization exists for a long time if you have the space that money can give you. Thank you, Jeff. I think this is important. We are talking about a club model here in this particular spreadsheet, but if you're listening, feel free to email me and we can do a nonprofit seasonal model too. I'm happy to work through this. The math and logic is very similar. The reason we do it this way, as Jeff said, is we're basically looking at your unit cost of goods sold. And we're saying like, if your class is unprofitable, fundamentally, you can't make the business work. So this spreadsheet is designed to make you realize how much a high level 2-hour class costs compared to a 45-minute TOTS program and then where you should spend your resources as a business. These are some ballpark stuff just for this spreadsheet, but you can type in your own over here. We've got some admin and general manager costs that Jeff was talking about earlier.
Quick on that. The admin would be typically the parent volunteer. Oftentimes in wrestling club, it's a mother who's very organized. That giving that person compensation for their work is critical to keeping them for a long time. And then same as the general manager, that would be the owner's cost or the on-site manager, whoever's making sure that everything continually happens within the organization, the tax filings are getting done, that the organization is being run effectively from the top level.
Revenue. So let's talk about this a little bit. This is very common. We're doing a 3-tier model here based on experience. So level 0 in this case would be like, 5 to 7 year olds, no experience. This is roll around on the mats, get fun, have a fun time. This is basic subscription per month stuff here. Anything in blue is editable. That modified this number here. And then this is where it gets really interesting to me, at least. You notice we've got the classes per week so that we can calculate on a per level, per class basis, how much this costs your organization. And then generally how the wrestler count impacts that cost. So if we were to look, for example, let's say you wanted to focus on level 0 here and we bump this up to 38 wrestlers. Because we're fundamentally doing less in expenses, our revenue per class goes way up compared to a revenue for a longer class, even though that subscription is higher priced. So I'm not saying you necessarily need to grow each of your levels for the same amount, but it's worth remembering here that your profit per class is based on both your fixed expenses and how much time you're spending with each wrestler every week. That's the most common mistake we see in general, at least that I see with clubs I work with, is everyone's focused up here at this elite level. Oh, we can charge $200 a month. And like suddenly you're in there with 3 classes a week for an hour and a half or 2 hours per class. And it's unprofitable for you. It actually fundamentally breaks the business.
It's really interesting because 90% of clubs, private or nonprofit, are all competing for those same level 3 and level 4 athletes. Those state and regional high performance kids, deep impact, tons of time, and they actually don't realize that it's the least financially profitable for the organization. And so I see so many clubs miss the opportunity to serve the zeros, the levels 1s and the level 2s, which are the base of your business, right? They're the base of your organization, both from a long-term athlete development perspective and from a financial stability perspective.
Absolutely. And you sort of see this in martial arts. I think wrestling is going through this sort of martial arts maturation stage too, as we professionalize it, where in the martial arts studio, the bulk of your revenue comes from the younger kids and you lose kids as they age. And that will, I think, be true for most healthy wrestling clubs as well. Retention is obviously important, but kids do other sports in high school. There's less and less elite people who want to come in. So if you're thinking about it from a pure business perspective, you really do want to focus on your level 0, level 1, level 2 as the base of your business and the feeder program for your elite, which a lot of coaches love. And that's great. But it's important to remember that these 2 programs, when you're doing less classes, are just more profitable, generally speaking. Notice our facility is a per hour cost. It's not a fixed rent. It's not a building in this model. Even if you own a building, try to break it out by hour, because if you're not using it and you own the building, you need to be renting it out. That cost, that's why we do it hourly here. So you also understand the value of you not using it for other things.
And I think that also the more programming, if you have a fixed cost and let's say you pay $2,000 a month in rent and you're using that facility 5 hours a week, your hourly costs, I'm just going to do some quick calculations. It's $100 an hour. You might be able to go and find a rec center that you can roll out a mat and reduce that cost by 70%. Right. And so understanding is it actually time to acquire a lease or acquire a property? Or is that just my ego saying, oh, I need this? When in reality, then you're paying 3 times as much money for facility use. Right? That's also a cultural constraint on wrestling. If you look at a lot of powerful club soccer programs, they book their facilities. How many club lacrosse programs own their facilities? How many club basketball programs own their facilities or have a master lease? Almost none. I guess the other thing I wanted to add on that is if I realize that if I have a fixed cost of my facility and I add hours of programming a week, right, I'm going to add the level 0 and 1 classes and try to fill those classes. That's going to also reduce my per hour facility cost as a whole, because now I have more programming going on, and it's going to increase my per hour revenue because I'm offering a higher revenue experience.
Absolutely. Anything else you wanted to cover in this sheet Jeff, that's sort of the quick analysis of why you should be looking at it on a per class basis.
No, I don't think much to touch on the sheet. I think the one thing that I really find valuable is profit per class, right? And I think that that is highly misunderstood within the clubs that I speak to. Nobody's really understanding their profit per class and really understanding which type of programming they should add and look to fill out. And so when you see $509 per class versus 212, well, and as a full-time coach, coaching a little kids class is fun and it's easy. And we run it off the same curriculum. We've got 12 practices we cycle through every quarter, and I run that same practice all week long. And then we go to week number 2 the next week. It just makes it fun, enjoyable, easy to produce, and very, very profitable for the organization. I think the one thing I would like to add is retention, right? Your retention should be 80 to 90%. The only way to have that high of level of retention is private lessons, small group focus. If you're doing mass practices and you bring a kid into a mass practice who's a 0, a 1, a 2, your retention's probably going to be at best 50 to 60%, even if you have an amazing program. So just understand your main metric, whether you're large or small, that you should be tracking is retention. All right. If you have any questions about pricing, you can reach me direct, Jeff@wrestlingiq.com or Matt@wrestlingiq.com. And you can always send a support at wrestlingiq.com inbox message, and it'll get forwarded to us so we can get back to you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.